Hi, and welcome to an episode of the Jet Rails podcast. I'm Robert Rand, your host, and I'm joined today by Tim from Leventis, and we're going to be talking with you about best practices for planning custom websites and applications. There's always going to be need for sites that and software that aren't cookie cutter, that aren't exactly like every other. That's usually some of the secret sauce, and the goal of today's episode is to really dive in a little bit about how you can plan for that successfully, where you're going to have a project that gets off the ground and that starts to really perform for you through launch and hopefully years of success. So with no further ado, Tim, would you do us the honor of introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Robert. Appreciate you having me on today. So my name's Tim Dolloff, and I've been in the custom software solution space for about 25 years. Most of my career, I've been helping businesses, clients build custom solutions that solve business problems. And what Leventis does is that's our primary business. We build custom software solutions. We have a heavy focus in e-commerce and financial technologies. But we do business application development across a number of different verticals, different industries, and that's what I'm passionate about.
Awesome. And one of my favorite questions on the podcast is to ask businesses with unique names, how did Leventis get its name?
Yeah, so the name was around before I was part of this organization, but the story that I've heard is it's basically based on a few different words that represent values of the company. So live, invent, and success. And so they took those values early on in the company and kind of combined them into a word.
Very cool. Oh, that's interesting. Usually you get maybe two things put together.
Yeah.
That's probably why I had to ask. I would not have guessed that if you had, if I had to throw something in the air.
Someone was ambitious 13 years ago, I guess.
Yeah. These days you really have to be, because everything's taken in Google now.
That's right.
Very hard to get a good domain. So tell me a little bit, custom can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. What types of custom websites and applications does Leventis build these days?
Sure. I'll give you some examples. As I mentioned, one big area of our business is e-commerce. And obviously there's a lot of, kind of off-the-shelf e-commerce solutions, but there's a lot of clients that have specialized needs for their e-commerce, whether they have unique products that they're trying to sell, they have a unique checkout process, they have unique marketing needs. And so we do have a lot of experience and a large focus in building custom e-commerce solutions, mostly based on the Magento framework, which is a very flexible, scalable framework. But we also do a lot of other types of business. We've done a lot of development for the leasing industry, so essentially helping them build out their credit pipeline tools and processes. So that's an example. We've built custom point of sale systems for very unique clients in specialized industries. We do a lot of business to business development. Some of it you could consider in that e-commerce space as well, but there's other B2B related tools that our clients have had needs for. So there's really no limit to what we're developing. Mostly we're talking about web applications or mobile applications that meet specialized needs. And we're usually looking for ways to help our clients solve business problems that there isn't an existing tool that will solve that. So that's why you would typically go custom.
And how is it that you identify initially that this is going to be what you would consider custom, even if there's maybe a framework somewhere underneath that you're starting from, which is often a good accelerator? But is it that the end user, or your client or customer is identifying that, or is it that your team is looking at the specs and saying maybe you thought that this was going to be more straightforward, but really what you need is not an off the shelf?
Yeah, it's a combination. Typically, if a client's coming to us, they don't already have a third-party off-the-shelf solution identified, because if they did, they'd probably be working with the vendor for that particular solution. Usually, they're coming to us with a business problem that they know they need automation, or they know they can use a tool, a software or system-related tool that would benefit their business process, and they don't know how to go about that. And the way we identify whether it's custom or not is we're not trying to reinvent the wheel for our clients. If an off-the-shelf solution is the right solution for them, we recommend it, and we'll 100% support them, and where we can assist, help them with the implementation of that tool or some combination of it. But a lot of the time, it's really about a return on investment decision. It's saying, hey, you could use this third-party tool, except you're going to have to change your business process. You're going to have to change your sales pipeline. You may have to hire additional people to support that adjusted process. And if that gets more expensive than the cost to build and support a custom solution, that's usually where the decision process comes in. Now, there's other benefits to custom solutions, but that's a big part of it, obviously. We're trying to help our clients drive business efficiencies, and that means potentially doing things with automation that don't require as much, staff, which is obviously payroll is a huge expense to businesses. So where you can help them, keep their costs as low as possible and stay as efficient as possible from a human resource perspective, that's a huge part of custom solutions and business automation. The other reason we'll do custom solutions sometimes is just because even though there's a third-party solution, it may not meet the business objectives exactly. Again, I mentioned that sometimes that's around messaging. So if our client wants to present a specific presence online, they want their brand to be on brand, and third-party tools don't offer that flexibility. They can't really provide the image that they're looking for. Then sometimes a custom solution makes sense there as well.
Absolutely. And would you say that are there cases where your team is more or less starting, not that there aren't pieces of code that, that you grab from other places, but where you're starting from more or less line one of code, not necessarily with with some kind of a framework like a Magento underneath, or usually, does it gravitate in that direction?
No, I would say about 60% of our projects are completely custom. They may rely to some extent on existing libraries, of course. They rely on existing languages and the libraries related to those languages. And where it makes sense, we may take advantage of control libraries or reporting libraries or things like that fit within that custom solution. But about 60% of our business is not based on an existing platform or framework. But I mentioned e-commerce being a fairly large piece of our business, and we mostly use Magento there. And there's a perfect example of where it makes sense to. There's no reason for us to reinvent the e-commerce wheel in most situations. You've already got a framework that has your catalog. You've got a lot of the order processing and the shopping tools and a lot of integration components. We don't need to build that all from scratch. It wouldn't make sense to.
Yeah, who really wants to start over with shipping and sales tax and the list goes on and on. I'm with you there. Coupon systems and it just gets unwieldy when you don't need to. Ideally, then you just start to build extensions or third-party apps that they'll connect in through the APIs. You work with what you've got, not to reinvent the wheel and to create something more sustainable. And I'm with you. To me, it's not necessarily always about saving on payroll. It's often about allocating resources. So instead of having to pay someone to do this thing that can be automated, they can be out there helping to grow your business in a better way. Sure. So I think that just as often, from what I've seen, when we're able to in the industry automate a job, it's not necessarily that we take away a job. It's that we let a business be all that more successful. And that's part of what I I love about we all get to do every day. So when these come to you, obviously, any e-commerce project, by and large, I'm sure, there are folks that spin up a quick, SaaS site or such and stick with, pre-existing theme and just throw in some content. Are there, and so, there might be a one-off case here and there where there isn't much of a project plan, but, for a more established business, there's always going to be a project plan if they want this thing up and off the ground successfully. How do you go about that process when it's going to be totally custom? I imagine that there's more information to collect in order to get it right, versus when you're using a framework like Magento where it already does certain things. So you sort of know what it's going to do right off the bat. Is it a bigger process to go through that particular project planning?
Yeah, so it does matter. It depends on the project and on the scope of the project and the complexity of it, of course. Although even with projects like e-commerce projects based on Magento, even though there's a basic platform, they probably wouldn't be coming to us. Our clients wouldn't be working with us if they didn't need customizations. So there's still the need to identify the requirements of the project, what the solution is going to look like, and plan that out to an extent. Now, we do follow an agile methodology, which is really considered a best practice in software development today. So there was the old school way of doing it where you said, hey, let's sit down for 2 months and gather all the requirements about this project.
Come up with waterfall.
Exactly. Yeah. So you come up with a full project plan and estimates on everything. And then the development team goes away for 6 months or a year and comes back and says, here's what you asked for a year ago. We all know that that's not the best way to go right now. The best way is for regular iterations, regular feedback from your stakeholders and from your clients, making sure that they have the opportunity to see how things are progressing and provide feedback as it's going through its development cycle. And the sooner in the process that you identify pivots, you identify requirements that are changing, or just even misunderstandings between what the requirements, how they were identified, and how they're implemented, sooner you do that, the least costly it is to fix it. So it makes a lot of sense to work more agilely. And what that means is that it's less about developing all the detailed requirements at the front of the project. It is more, at this point, our discovery tends to be more about the high level business needs, and what the pain points are, what's the problem we're trying to solve, what are the general overall needs of the project, to make sure that as we start to build out the first components, that we're doing that holistically with how the rest of the solution is going to be built out. So there has to be an overarching understanding of what the project is going to solve, and how we're going to go about that. But we don't have to get into quite the level of detail. So that said, we still tend to do a bit of a kind of, as we start talking to a client about a project, there's an analysis at the beginning to understand the high level needs. There's often a discovery phase still where we are getting a little deeper. We're understanding more about the systems that we may be integrating with, if they have existing systems that this new tool is going to be tied into. So there's still some discovery that has to happen up front, and planning that has to happen up front. And in our business as well, our clients are still looking for an understanding of the cost of a project. So we do have to have enough detail to roughly scope out how many resources a project at this scale is going to work or use, and how many man hours and how much time, so that we can actually give them some idea of what the budget is going to be needed.
Yeah, but from there, it's about, if I'm hearing it correctly, figuring out the minimal viable project, exactly what can be delivered, and then further iterated on. But what's going to get this project launched and successful, and that changes over time. So maybe let's say Magento's in the mix. Maybe making sure that this latest security patch is installed is important for launch, and maybe that, I don't know, that, gift card feature, they could live without for a couple of months. And so priorities change. That's the beautiful side of that agile method, is it's really about what brings value, and not just, not just what got decided months ago, as you suggested.
Yeah, and I've got a perfect example of that. As today, just from the news from the last couple of weeks with the coronavirus, a lot of our businesses are drastically changing priorities in very short notice. And so that, even to the extent of, we just signed on a deal with a new client that's looking for changes to their existing e-commerce platform. And we had an initiative built out with them, and we signed it last week, and we were ready to get started on development. And that they reached out today and said, our business initiatives have changed drastically, so we're ready to shift direction here. We're in a state where we can absolutely do that with them.
Oh, that's fantastic. And that's how relationships are meant to be. That's how you keep long-term happy clients as an agency. It's by supporting their needs, not just, focusing on the piece of paper.
That's right.
So the very definition of being agile. And what happens? So you get this site launched, maintenance, management ongoing for a site like that. I imagine that if it's a completely custom application, there's no patches coming down the pike. So any updates that are being made are going to come from your team. If it's based on a framework, then maybe there's a mix. Maybe some of the custom work you've done needs to be maintained, such as new versions of PHP get rolled out. And maybe there's official patches for the core or for purchased extensions and things. How does your team plan for that? How do you set up for success with clients, knowing that it's a custom project?
Sure. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Obviously, some of your framework related projects like Magento or WordPress related projects, they do have ongoing patches. So you have to plan for that. It's critical to keep those security patches installed and making sure that the client and their customers' data is safe and their systems are safe. But there is some of that on a fully custom solution as well. You mentioned PHP. A lot of our custom solutions are built in the Microsoft Stack framework, and so same thing with PHP. There are versions of .NET that get deprecated over time. There are specific specific functions within or older versions of a framework that will get deprecated over time. So it's still important to keep those frameworks and essentially the languages that you're working with up to date and the libraries that you're using up to date. Even on our custom solutions, as I mentioned, sometimes we are using existing libraries, whether it's function libraries, whether it's a reporting tool set, and those things also have patches that get released for them. So even with custom solutions, there are components that do have security patches. We also have to help our clients be aware of things that are outside of the software environment, like their web server, their database application server, the OS that these things are running on, their firewalls. If there's not a plan in place to maintain those are also potential security risks to the application, even if it's not a problem with the code itself. Beyond that, from a maintenance perspective, there are other things that require maintenance that are beyond security patching. Optimization is a key thing. As an application gets used more and more, and you get more data in the system, you may get to a point where the amount of records that are being scanned for a particular function are much greater than the client ever anticipated, or greater than testing happened on. And so we have to monitor and watch for where those optimizations can come into play, and continually address them. There's refactoring of code. Best practices in technology occur over time, and so it's important that when you build a custom solution, you don't just forget about it for 15 years because future browsers may no longer support that particular functional set. And there's a lot of specific examples I could go into there. But then another large part of what we consider maintenance has to do just with user feedback. And as I mentioned, we get feedback from the stakeholders whenever we're developing an application, but most of the applications that we develop end up having many more users than just the stakeholders that commissioned and are asking for it. It may be internal business users, but the team that we built it out for maybe 3 people helped us kind of plan the requirements and design it in development, but there might be 20 other users that are actually using the system. Or in a consumer-facing application, you could have hundreds, thousands, or millions of users that are using it, and you're going to get feedback. And if you're building an application that's supposed to support your business or your customers, you want to respond to that feedback. So part of maintenance is making sure that your clients are getting the support, that your customers are getting a tool that's usable for them, and understanding when there's feedback that they've given, whether it's based on user experience or whether it's based on browser compatibility or whether it's based on accessibility, that those things can be supported over time, and we can respond to that feedback. So maintenance covers security, ongoing optimization, and best practices, but also just ongoing user feedback.
Yeah, I mean, one of my coworkers here at JetRails talks all the time about that trifecta, that you need the customer to be involved at at an appropriate level. You need a development team that's really stepping up to the plate, and you need a hosting team doing the same, and they've all got to work well in tandem together. Otherwise, the long-term viability isn't all that great. We still see lots of users that just try to self-host on AWS, not fully managing, monitoring, maintaining. And by the time that we get there, they've hit some pain points. I imagine that your team has seen your share of projects that you didn't necessarily start, but that you've taken over. Looking at that maybe from the reverse, when you're doing something custom, Magento has documentation,
Sure.
but custom work documentation, generally speaking, doesn't exist. You just wrote the code, you just wrote the application or the extensions or plugins or modules or what have you. What type of rule of thumb is there in terms of providing documentation when it comes to these applications? Is it sometimes about providing some material as these businesses hire more employees and need to train them on how to use the software? Is it about, if there's ever going to be new developers working on some facet of the project? How does that come about?
Sure. Yeah, you kind of nailed a couple important points there. One is the maintainability of the application. So the code and the infrastructure and the architecture of it needs to have clear documentation, because whether it's on our team, where we do have team members that move around to different projects, we want to make sure that we can support that application 5 years from now or 10 years from now, even if it's completely different developers that are involved in that process. So we keep a clear repository of documentation internally about every client system and application. That's all documentation that we'll freely share with our clients if if it's part of their request or they ask for it at any time. But it's important for us to keep that for our own ongoing maintenance of the application and make sure that there's a clear line of handoff as team members change or team members move around to different projects. And that's just to go a little bit more morose there. We also call that the bus plan, because you have to make sure that any one person in your organization, if they were to get hit by a bus or whatever happened to them, that there's that it's not going to cause a failure in the ability to support the business and the application.
A lot of these applications and sites wind up being central to these businesses. So there's a lot of people whose success and livelihood are on the line when when that person disappears. On the hosting side, we see it as when you've got that one server guy and he's out of the country or unavailable, or something happens. No one else knows how to access things, how to maintain things. You become up a creek without that proverbial paddle.
Right.
Absolutely, the same thing applies to development. That when there's that custom system, there's no documentation. No one knows what's going on. It's a lot of work to try to read through someone else's code and understand what they were trying to get at.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even about being able to read the code. Sometimes it's even getting access to the code. Whether it's libraries that were compiled and then the original source code wasn't stored in a secure repository that's accessible by the team members that need it. So absolutely, the documentation and maintaining a clear process for handoff is an important part of the development life cycle. The other part of documentation, which you touched on, was user documentation. And that comes in a couple different forms. For our clients that are developing applications for their consumers, a lot of the time that is more in the form of kind of a marketing type of documentation, something that shows the consumers how to use the basics of the tool, but also markets the value that they're getting for it, from that tool, or why you're working with them, or their internal business applications where it really is more of a training guide, a user guide, so that anybody who's using that system can reference it, can learn how to use it, learn where to go to find what they need to. And the quality of that documentation is particularly important to make sure that they can reference the information they need to do their job easily, and that if a new team member comes in and joins the team, they can be trained with it and learn how to use it the same way.
Well, makes sense to me. And, when you're getting involved in a custom project like this, are there any, or when someone asks for one, are there any common concerns that you have that I'll bring it back to maybe a risk analysis that you want to make sure that they know that the client knows what they're about to get involved in? any sort of process for that to make sure that everyone is on the same page, and you're setting not only yourself but the client up for success by going with a custom project.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some clear kind of common value to going with a custom solution. One is third-party solutions that are out there that are heavily used in the marketplace are going to be the most likely to be targeted by hackers or by for exploits. And so one of the values of going with the custom solution is it does remove some of that risk. It takes it away because it's just less visible. The hackers, unless they're specifically targeting that business or that customer, are not going to know to even look for this particular code or to look for this solution. So that is one of the risks that we look at with a third-party solution. And even the third-party solutions that we work with frequently, the libraries that we work with, or the platforms like Magento or WordPress, we have to take that risk into account as we're making a decision on which type of solution we go with. But there are other factors too. Risks like maintainability is very important. So one of the things that's important, an important decision when going with the custom solution, is that if that custom solution is built off a language or a framework that is fairly common, fairly well supported, you always have a path to support that in the future. If you are using a third-party solution that is very proprietary, that's not open source, that's closed box, that's black box, that means that you're dependent on that vendor indefinitely to support it. And although we build awesome relationships with our clients, we hope that they're always working with us to support their applications. Because we work on common frameworks and with common languages, and because we provide all of the code and accessibility to that code to those clients, they have the opportunity to maybe hire their own internal development team or take over that project from their own internal development team if they need to. If you're working with the third-party solution, you never have that option. And you also have the risk, what happens if that third-party vendor goes out of business? What if they get acquired and change their service level, agreements, and change their service offerings? So those are a lot of the items of risk assessment that we go through with the client when making a decision between a custom solution and an off-the-shelf solution.
Sure. I mean, and a lot of topics that we run into. We just had an episode on the podcast with Sakuri, where, for sure, there's good data from companies like Sakuri that's going to show that the platforms that are at the most risk of hacking attempts and such, they're the most common platforms. It may seem obvious, but hackers get to just scan various WordPress sites, Magento sites, other sites, looking for known vulnerabilities, like sites that aren't up to date on patching.
Sure.
And so that's certainly an issue. At JetRails, we put a lot into play to help our customers on platforms like those to protect themselves, so that that's less of an issue. But it's certainly part of the reality that you have to be vigilant. And, in terms of software being supported, we're running into lots of merchants that are still on Magento 1 that are going to try to hold off vacating that platform as long as they can, get as much value out of their investment into Magento 1 as they can. And, we're putting out a lot of material and, putting a lot into play to help those merchants to do that successfully. But there's a lot of businesses out there that wish that Magento 1 wasn't reaching its official end of life, and that they didn't need anything else, and that would just live on. And when you're dealing custom, it is a bit different. I'm sure there could come a point where the viability of something, let's say that something, way back when 10 years ago was built with Flash. Well, that's just a language that's naturally come and gone.
Yep.
And so, there's no guarantee that your site is going to really be maintainable forever without some rebuild. But it's nice when at least sometimes you're in the driver's seat.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, that's definitely one of the advantages with it. And like you mentioned, obviously there's still, even though there is some risk with that, with some of these third-party solutions, it doesn't mean they're not the right solution. It's just that's a conversation that we have with our clients. I think it's important to have that full understanding of what the risks are when you start a project.
Yeah. So, I imagine that there are times that, going back to maybe some of those initial questions I was asking, that there's someone that comes in and they're requesting custom, and you tell them you don't really need to go custom. You can use this off the shelf and it's going to be perfect. It's going to save you money. It's going to be easier to maintain, and vice versa. So that's probably par for the course.
Sure.
Yeah. And, I'll add, I think this has been a, fantastic look at the overall process and planning and thought patterns that should be happening for projects like these. Any final thoughts? Anything else that comes to mind?
No, not. I would just say, I guess, that again, kind of reiterating the reason why you want to look at a custom solution, and why you want to look at a partner that is going to help you build that solution is the flexibility you get from it. Essentially what it's giving you is complete control over how you run your business and the processes that you follow. If you're going to be competitive, you have to stand out. So if you're doing the same thing with the same tools that your competitors are doing, you probably aren't finding any particular efficiencies. You haven't found the way to run your business better than someone else. If you can identify opportunities to improve your business processes, then it's about finding or creating the tools that are going to support those those specializations and those changes. So I think it's really helpful for people to understand, business users to understand, that off the shelf is not the only way to go. There sometimes it's the right fit, but there are other great solutions out there.
Absolutely. Tim, I can't thank you enough for joining today. As always, to our listeners, feel free to subscribe wherever you listen to fine podcasts like this, as well as on YouTube, social media, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn at JetRails. You'll hear about the latest episodes and be able to track some great content that we're putting together for you. And to all those sellers out there, we know that there's a lot going on in the market right now. Some folks are seeing a lot of ups, others are seeing various downs. We're going to try to focus on sharing information in the coming weeks that's going to help through that and help you navigate. We're here for you. If you do have particular questions about things that are coming up in your business that weren't in the past, feel free to reach out, whether we just give you a free consult and try to help however we can, or whether we steer you towards some partners, or create an episode around your question. We'd love to hear from you, and happy selling, everyone. Stay healthy.
Thanks, Robert.